Nebuchadnezzar meets Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. And incidentally, those names that I've just given were the ones that Nebuchadnezzar gave to them. Apart from Daniel, his name was Belteshazzar. But we'll see how very meaningful that is. But here we are contemplating in this hour of divine service Nebuchadnezzar, as we are learning about him and lessons from him as he meets the four princes. And we are beholding God's way of using the faithful, God's way of using the faithful to interact with the heathen, to convert them. We are looking at God's way. Remember, God's ways are not our ways. We are seeking to understand how God actually works, different to what we think. We remember that what we have seen during this convention so far is that Israel had failed dismally as a nation to be the witnesses that God had called them to be to the world. And because of their dismal failure, God orchestrated their captivity so that while the leadership and the church failed him, there was a little remnant, the faithful few within, that he could then use to fulfill his purpose that he had promised about his church, his faithful Israel, that were no longer faithful. And here I want to read this from inspiration so that we can receive. And I'm reading from the Youth Instructor here, the Youth Instructor, May 14, the Appreciation 3, there in paragraph 12. The children of Israel would take the principles, the purpose of God. They were not exercising the fidelity that they were called upon to exercise. What were they doing? They did not maintain the principles unadulterated by, in short, the world. How many churches today are in that very condition? They are adulterating the things of God with the world. And that was what Israel was doing back there. The people who should have been a light amid the surrounding darkness disregarded the word of the Lord. Remember, he said there, arise, shine, for the light has come. They disregarded that. They lived, think carefully what I'm reading, they lived for themselves and neglected to do the special work God had appointed them. And because of their failure to fulfill his purpose, the failure of that they didn't have that fidelity with which to fulfill God's purpose. You can see that's why I wrote it on the whiteboard there, so that you can see this streaming all the way through this particular subject. Because of their failure to fulfill his purpose, he permitted them to be humbled by an idolatrous nation. God's people humbled by idolaters. Can you see what he's trying to impress upon the minds of the people? And one more very meaningful quote to just enlarge on this a little more. Bible Commentary, Volume 4, page 1144, paragraph 4. 1144, paragraph 4 says, "When the Jews were dispersed from Jerusalem, there were among them young men and women who were firm as a rock to principle, men and women who had not pursued a course to make the Lord ashamed to call them his people. These were sad at heart, for the backsliding which they could not prevent. Suffer with the guilty. But God, these innocent sufficient for their day. It was to them that the message of encouragement was sent. The hope of the nation lay in those young men and maidens who would preserve their integrity. And in their captivity, these obedient ones, firmly to correct principles, they would have influence over their idolatrous companions, have imparted light in every place where they were scattered. But they remained impenitent, and still heavier punishment came upon them. Their calamities were sent for their purification. God would bring them through to a place where they would be instructed. So God wasn't finished with the church at that time. That although they were taken into captivity, although Jerusalem was destroyed, yet it was not the end. The end didn't come until they rejected their Savior in the first advent of Jesus Christ. There they crucified him, and then they stoned Stephen, and then that was the end. But there are lessons to learn for us who are living now at the end, when God is going to make a full end. And what was it there? These faithful individuals, young men and maidens. Does that include some of you here? God wants you to be so faithful to the principles that God wants us to reveal by fidelity to the world around us. So our focus throughout this whole conference is upon Nebuchadnezzar in relation to that, because these people were to represent to the heathen nation the reality of God. And we're looking at Nebuchadnezzar, the king of that nation, of that idolatrous empire. And so we are going to watch God. We're going to watch God moving on Nebuchadnezzar to expose him to the faithful and thus operate to convert his soul. We are watching this detail, to watch him moving upon Nebuchadnezzar with his particular idolatrous background, watching God moving upon him and thus expose him to the faithful that he had taken into captivity, so that Nebuchadnezzar could be converted. It's a profound mind exercise here. We have already seen that Nebuchadnezzar had a very astute and intelligent mind, that in his wisdom, as he was conquering the nations, he was trying to conquer them not to obliterate them, but to to give them the power, the right, the privilege to rule, continue to rule in their nations under him. That was his strategy, that he would be the wisest king of any empire. The other empires all destroyed their other nations and devoured them and continued to have control over them entirely and sent out their particular leaders. But this king, he was smart. He was going to be such a wise person so that the people, the nations could still rule themselves as vassals under him. That was his strategy. But of course, those that wouldn't submit, although he was such a wise king, he lost his wisdom and shattered some of them, like Jerusalem ultimately. We've gone through all that to some degree already. Notice what his strategy was as he invaded Jerusalem, because at that time he was still leaving Jerusalem in that particular stage. In Daniel chapter 1, he was taking some of the cream of the inhabitants of Jerusalem to come into his realm. Looking here at Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. Daniel chapter 1, and there we read verse 1 and 3, and then 3 to 5. Daniel 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, he was the next one after Josiah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. In the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, he continued to reign for another 7-8 years after that. And there in that particular year, Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged Jerusalem. And what did he do? Verse 3, and the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring, so after they had surrounded and invaded the city, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favoured and skillful in all wisdom and cunning, in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, of whom they might teach the learning of the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now, are you picking up the strategy, the intelligence of this king? He was not only going to ruling, he was going to take the cream of the intelligentsia of those nations. He was going to take the princes, people, as it says there, who had cunning in knowledge and understanding science, so that he could benefit his kingdom by their input after he had trained them. Can you see what sort of a man he was? A remarkable man. And we see this, and God saw that, and he knew that, a wisdom that God could use. There was a wisdom in this man of the world that God could use to orchestrate a change in this man, to convert him. This is what we're looking at here. The intelligence of this man and God, the way he works with these intelligent men. Notice what we had been reading there in the strategy of Nebuchadnezzar. Who were the princes among all the ones that he had taken out of Jerusalem as captives to take there and to train them under him, to the cream of the intelligentsia there? That we are actually looking now at 4 of these princes. Daniel chapter 1 verse 6, here it is. Now among these princes were of the children of Judah Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These were the Jewish names of these 3 young men. And we are looking here at how King Nebuchadnezzar meets these princes. At this time he hadn't met them. He had just committed them under the care of Ashpenaz, and he had to take care of them and to place them under the tuition for 3 years. So I'm reading from a quote from the Spirit of Prophecy here, Counsels to Stand Alone, CSA. It's an interesting title, isn't it? To stand alone. We're reading about these men who had to stand alone. So CSA, page 53, paragraph 3, here it is. Among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, that I just read. Seeing in these youths the promise of remarkable ability, Nebuchadnezzar determined that they should be trained to fill important positions in his kingdom. They were to fill important positions. These foreigners, under his training, would fulfill. See the mind of this man? They would fulfill important positions in his kingdom, that they might be fully qualified for their life work. He arranged for them to learn the language of the Chaldeans, and for 3 years to be granted the unusual educational advantages afforded princes of the realm. He took them in to be part of his university. They were going to be under the University of the Chaldeans. Now I'm going to read something afterwards. There are people who think, as Christians, we can go to the universities today because look, Daniel, but don't get hoodwinked by that, because we're going to read something there that they didn't do that because they wanted to be under a worldly university. They were captives. And I'm going to read that. But here in Bible, in the Sanctified Life, I continued to read. The Sanctified Life, page 20. There I'm reading. Daniel was subjected to the severest temptations that can assail the youth of today. He was taken into this pagan empire to be trained by the severe temptations. Yet he was true to the religious instruction received in early life. He was surrounded with influences calculated to subvert those who would vacillate between principle and inclination. Yet the Word of God presents him as a faultless character. Now, did you notice what I just read there? He was surrounded with influences calculated to subvert. Is that true in our influences that surround us today? Are we in exactly the same position? And all young people going to school, it's interesting here that there are young people who have gone homeschooling, and they're not being sent to university, because there you are going to be surrounded by influences that are calculated to subvert you. That's why your parents decided there's going to be homeschooling, so that you are not under those kind of influences to subvert you. But these young men were put in that place by being captive under Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel dared not trust his own moral power. Prayer was to him a necessity. He needed to pray that he wouldn't be subverted. He made God his strength, and the fear of God was continually before him in all the transactions of his life. These are very, very important ingredients here as we continue to seek to understand, because the measure, rather the strength of Daniel, is the measure by which the fidelity with which he fulfills God's purpose. This is the main theme running all the way through this philosophy. Daniel possessed the grace of genuine meekness. He was true, firm, and noble. He sought to live in peace with all. To live in peace with all, even the pagans, right? While he was unbending as the lofty cedar wherever principle was involved. True fidelity, yes? In everything that he did, in everything that did not come in collision with his allegiance to God. Two very important principles here. Anything that did not come in collision with God, he was respectful and obedient to those who had authority over him. But he had so high a sense of the claims of God that the requirements of earthly rulers were held subordinate. He would not be induced by any selfish consideration to swerve from his duty. This is the meaning of true fidelity. This is what it is. The character of Daniel is presented to the world as a striking example of what God's grace can make of men fallen by nature and corrupted by sin. So if you think, oh, well, that's Daniel, I can't measure up with that. Just a moment. What did I just read? God's grace produces that. God's grace produces that. The record of his noble, self-denying life is an encouragement, not a discouragement. This is not a reproach to anybody. You think, oh, well, I can't reach such a high standard. That's doubting God. Don't ever think it or let that thought stay with you, and don't ever verbalize it that you cannot reach such a high standard. By God's grace, Daniel reached it there because of that. And the record of his noble self-denial humanity. He was no different to any one of the young people here. It was just he made a decision. You've got to make a decision. Say, from this example, we may gather strength to nobly resist temptation and firmly and in the grace of meekness stand for the right under the severest trial. we are learning lessons, we need to be very diligent to listen to and to pick up. So, another beautiful quote comes from Prophets and Kings 4:83. It says, Prophets and Kings 4:83, the approval of God was dearer to Daniel than the favor of the most powerful earthly potentate, dearer than life itself. Are you picking up what we need to embrace, to stand as in these last days for God, to be the faithful remnant? That the approval of God, God's purpose, was dearer to Daniel than the favor of the most powerful earthly potentate, dearer than life itself. This was the caliber of the ones that God will use as his missionaries to save souls. Are you picking up on what a missionary is? Oh, so easy to just do missionary work on a sort of an offhanded manner. Oh yeah, it might be a bit of a decision to go and put literature in letterboxes and to invite people to studies and things like that. That missionary work is not unnecessary, but it's only just a surface of missionary work. What I've just been reading here is to be a missionary in living manifestation. That's what missionary work is. And we read it here very powerfully expressed. We behold the true missionary work activity that we are to engage in. I'm reading from Bible Commentary, Volume 4, page 1166 in paragraph 6. Because Daniel was given this place and to receive the food of the king. We're going to come back to that statement directly, but I'm just reading it first of all. When Daniel was in Babylon, he was beset with temptations of which we have never dreamed. Imagine the temptation. He was honored by the greatest king of the world empire. He was honored. Come and sit at my table and eat my food. Wow. He was honored to go to the university of the king. What sort of temptations do you think this is? And while he was working on his part, God worked also and gave him knowledge and skill and all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. This was the way God worked for Daniel, and he does not propose, and what does it say? He does not propose to do any differently now. Man must cooperate with God in carrying out the plan of salvation. Can you see what we are here seeking to understand? The important lessons that are written here for us. And I want to continue to read from Christ Object Lessons, page 356, paragraph 3, where we read, Only by faithfulness, follow carefully, faithfulness in little things can the soul be trained to act with fidelity under the larger responsibilities. You know, I read this as a youth, your age, young people, and I thought, right, the Lord wants me to be faithful in little things. And you know, I've proven that to be true. By being very fastidious in little things, it trained me to be careful about the bigger things. And that's exactly what Daniel was being taught. It says, God, and here's the word again, that word fidelity. Only by faithfulness in little things can the soul be trained to act with fidelity under larger responsibilities. God brought Daniel and his fellows in connection with the great men of Babylon, that these heathen men might become acquainted with the principles of true religion. The heathen men were to become acquainted with the principles of true religion. That's why these young men were exposed to them. In the midst of a nation of idolaters, Daniel was to represent the character of God. See what a missionary is to be? To represent the character of God. How did he become fitted for a position of so great trust and honor? It was his faithfulness in little things that gave complexion to his whole life. He honored God in the smallest duties, and the Lord cooperated with him. The smallest what? Duties. Children, are there ever duties given you in the home? And if you will be faithful in those things that you think, oh, it's just something small, I don't care. No, if you will be extremely faithful there, it will give you complexion in the rest of your life, because it's going to affect you ever after if you will be trained to be absolutely faithful to God in the smallest duties, to cooperate with God. Do you realize that you can actually cooperate with God in the mundane things of life? That's what Daniel learned. To Daniel and his companions, God gave knowledge and skill in learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all the visions and dreams. Page 357, paragraph 1 goes on to say, as God called Daniel to witness for him in Babylon, so he calls us to be his witnesses in the world today, in the smallest as well as the largest affairs of life. He desires us to reveal to men the principles of his kingdom. Can you see the true missionary work? This is true missionary work. And as I was studying with this elder in the Adventist church in New Zealand, he discovered it because I went with him. He was an electrician. And I went with him and we were talking about the things that pertain to eternal life while we were doing the mundane things, so-called, irreligious things or just necessary duties. And after a period of time with him, he said, I've been an elder of this church for a long time, and we've done missionary work. And once we've done missionary work, we said, that's done, and now we go on in our ordinary life again. He said, you've taught me something else, just what I've read here, that our missionary work is every day, in every duty that we perform. It's never a time to say, I'm not a missionary any longer. All the time. This is your life. If you are learning from these lessons. So, having seen that now, consider now, as we turn our attention to Nebuchadnezzar, his strategy which God used, his strategy to bring these young princes into his life, to reverse the strategies that he was using by the faithfulness of these young men. He was a smart man, Nebuchadnezzar. And let's have a look at what his smartness was, his strategy to subvert. Some very important things here that we must learn that Satan is using today. And young people, you're homeschooling, you're being protected, but you are not out of danger. because the world is, Satan's working through the world eventually to make you doubt whether your parents were wise in doing homeschooling. It's much more important to do what God says to you to do and cooperate with him, and then you can come forth as Daniel. Because look at the strategies that surrounded them, which we can compare our situation with today. I am reading here from Daniel chapter 1 verse 7, the strategy of Nebuchadnezzar, this smart man, unto whom the princes of the eunuchs gave names. Remember, their name was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And he gave them names, for he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and Hananiah of Shadrach, and Mishael of Meshach. That was pretty close to Mishael, wasn't it? And to Azariah, Abednego. Now, why did God let this happen, that Nebuchadnezzar would give them change of names? Let's go to chapter 4 for a moment, verse 8. Because in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is owning up. He's actually saying what he did this for. Daniel chapter 4 verse 8, where it says, "But at the last Daniel came in before me," there's another occasion, "whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and before him I told the dream." Now, what did Nebuchadnezzar give them those names for? He gave them heathen god names. What for? Let me read it from the Spirit of Prophecy. Why did he give them those names? I'm reading from Prophets and Kings, page 480, paragraph 3. "The names of Daniel and his companions were changed to names representing Chaldean deities. Great significance was attached to the names given by Hebrew parents to their children. After these, often these stood for the traits of character that the parent desired to see develop in the child. The prince in whose charge the captive youth were placed gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego." Why? Follow very carefully now. The king did not compel the Hebrew youth to renounce their faith in favor of idolatry, but he hoped to bring this about gradually. Look at the smart man. By giving them names significant of idolatry, by bringing them daily into close association with idolatrous customs and under the influence of the seductive rites. What are they? Seductive? Seductive rites of heathen worship. He hoped to induce them to renounce the religion of their nation and to unite with the worship of the Babylonians. Is there anything today that Satan uses in exactly the same way? Seductive, of heathen. What has the heathen music done to Christian music today? They have blended the rock music of the world, the country and western style of dance music, to religious words. Subtle. And the Adventists fell for it. And that's why today, if you go to a Seventh-day Adventist camp, you will hear rock music that the young people are singing religious words to. That's how subtle. And here we see the example of it. So Daniel was surrounded with influences calculated to subvert. So are we. And now, besides that, what else was King Nebuchadnezzar doing to subvert them? And that was Daniel chapter 1, we know so well, verse 5, where it says, the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's food and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So that was another thing he wanted to use, the food, subtle influences to eat. You know, the subtle influence of, wow, we can eat of the lush food of the king. That's an attractive thing, isn't it? Well, what does it say here in verse 8 of Daniel 1? But Daniel purposed in his heart. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. He saw through that because he had been faithful in little things. And so we must be alert to the subtleties which are being placed before us. And I like the way that Sister White enlarges that in Bible Commentary, Volume 4, page 1166, which I said I was going to come back to. 1166, paragraph 6. When Daniel was in Babylon, he was beset with temptations of which we never dreamed, and he realized that he must keep his body under. Now, here's a very important principle. What are we to do with our human flesh, with our human body? We are to keep it under. He purposed in his heart that he would not drink of the king's wine or eat of his dainties. He knew that in order to come off a victor, he must have clear mental perceptions, that he might know that that he might discern between right and wrong. He had to discern between right and wrong, therefore he would not partake and defile himself. The understanding of true health reform is not merely that we have to do as we're told. The understanding of true health reform, and young people, please pick this up, it was a temptation to partake of the beautiful dainties of the king. We today are surrounded with these dainties, with these delicious, unhealthy foods. And we are to do what Daniel did. If we're going to discern clearly right between right and wrong. Very important to pick up this link, this thought pattern here. The health reform is being given to us. We are called upon to fast in the Day of Atonement. Why? The true fast of the Day of Atonement is the health reform that's been given us, so that we might discern between good and evil, that we might be able to discern what's going on in heaven right now for character perfection. That's what the health reform has been given to us for, and that's what is demonstrated here, so that Daniel would and his friends would discern between right and wrong. While he was working on his part, God worked also and gave him knowledge and skill and understanding. Here are these important lessons, and how Nebuchadnezzar was subtly working, and it was faithfulness by these faithful people that they would not become or fall for those temptations. So instead of, and now because Daniel was and his friends were so fastidious, so filled with fidelity, so loyal to God, that without the king knowing, what did Daniel do? He made a decision to talk to his boss at the time. Look, just give us pulse, just give us vegetarian food and water, no wine. Oh, he thought, if I do this, I'm going to get slaughtered. He said, no, just try us for 10 days and then check us out. And so he gave them that for 10 days, and now they were healthier and better than all the other ones that were eating the king's food. And so he trusted now. He said, okay then. And then, as we know, after those 3 years, what was the result? Let's go and read a powerful little quote here, that while Nebuchadnezzar was strategically trying to work to twist these young people, by their firmness, he was twisted. A very interesting meditation here. Counsels again to stand alone. CSA, page 53, paragraph 1. The fact that these men, worshippers of Jehovah, were captives in Babylon, and that the vessels of God's house had been placed in the temple of the Babylonish gods, was boastfully cited by the victors as evidence that their religion and customs were superior to the religion and customs of the Hebrews. See how the leaders of the church failed the Lord so bitterly? But these young people were now going to work, it says, yet, through the very humiliations that Israel's departure from him had invited, God gave Babylon evidence of his supremacy, of the holiness of his requirements, and of the sure results of obedience. And this testimony he gave as alone it could be given through those who were loyal to him. And so now, through the influence of Nebuchadnezzar meeting these young men, what he had strategically manipulated fell back upon himself. And it had an effect on him ultimately, which we are continuing through this camp to study. The impact of Daniel's faithfulness upon Nebuchadnezzar was demonstrated here in Daniel chapter 1, verse 16 onwards. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge, because they were working in cooperation with God now. God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all the visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding the king inquired of them. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. Isn't that a beautiful story? That Nebuchadnezzar strategically tried to manipulate them in one direction, turned against him. That all his magicians and all his great men, that he was going to use the captives to bung, they were much better than all his others. Counsels to stand alone. Page 55, paragraph 1. She says, for 3 years the Hebrew youth studied to acquire the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. During this time, they held fast their allegiance to God and depended constantly upon His power. With their habits of self-denial, they united earnestness of purpose, diligence, and steadfastness. What was that? Fidelity. They united that. It was not, now here it is, people to go to university, and many Adventists, they think we should go to university, and don't let yourself get hoodwinked, young people, because what does it say here? You know, they'll point to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel and say, see, they went to university, so it's all right. I've heard people say that to young people. But notice what it says. It was not pride of ambition that had brought them into the king's court or into the university of the king. Into there by infinite wisdom, separated from home influences and sacred associations, they sought to acquit themselves creditably for the honor of their downtrodden people and for the glory of him whose servants they were. They attended the king's university for only one reason: because they were captives. They couldn't help but be there. And that's where God helps them. But if you do it for, as it says there, for pride of ambition, I'm going to become a great person through university, you're going to be affected by university. You can't avoid it. And I've seen beautiful young men affected by the mentality that was installed through the university. That's why the young men who go to Avondale College today are perverted for that reason, because man's philosophy comes through and perverts them. What do you want to go to university or to Avondale College for? To be perverted? No way. Because it's subtle. And today it's gone to extremes. So I read again from paragraph 3 and 4 of this CSA. When the time like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, their keen comprehension, their wide knowledge, their choice and exact language testified to the unimpaired strength and vigor of their mental powers. In all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers. Therefore stood they before the king. At the court of Babylon were gathered representatives from all lands, men of the highest talent, men of the most richly endowed with natural gifts, and possessed of broadest culture that the world could bestow. Yet among them all, the Hebrew youth were without a peer. Have you heard of peer pressure? In the world, you're under peer pressure. But these people, these young men, they put peer pressure on everybody else because they were under God's tuition. They were without a peer. Beautiful language here. In physical strength and beauty, in mental vigor and literary attainment, they stood unrivaled. The erect form, the firm elastic step, the fair countenance, and the undimmed senses, the untainted breath, all were so many certificates, see this? Certificates of good habits, insignia of the nobility with which nature honours those who are obedient to her laws. You know, you are here, young people, at the moment, under a most beautiful tuition that comes directly from heaven. Don't let it slip. Powerful. So, What have we observed during this hour? We have received a knowledge of God that is most valuable to us. He takes heathen unbelievers and brings them into contact with his chosen servants by means of punishing their apostate associates. Can you get your head around what I just communicated here? Because that's what we want to draw our lesson from. God takes heathen unbelievers and brings them into contact with his chosen servants. How? By means of punishing their apostate associates. I marvel at God's intelligence. We also saw that by the faithfulness of God's servants, the very instruments of wrath have the opportunity of salvation. Remember who God chose Nebuchadnezzar as an instrument of God's wrath. He used the hasty and cruel Chaldeans, and God brought them in touch with his faithful little remnant. And what? Those instruments of wrath had an opportunity for salvation. What a meditation. The remnant today, the little remnant, only a few in each place, the little remnant today are to be used by their purity of principle in the circumstances that are most negative. Attacked by the enemies, taken to court, and there, by their pure characters, to win the souls who had not yet closed the doors of their probation. Because when God's people stand in the courts, probation has closed for apostate modern Israel. But those faithful ones are going to be used because probation hasn't fully closed for the wicked. And for those that are maybe beautiful characters like Nebuchadnezzar, that can still be turned around very quickly. Because they are, remember, God saw Nebuchadnezzar as his child. And what does it say? Come out of her, my people. This is God's mind that we are looking at in this subject. And so may God help us to remain closely aligned with everything that we are studying here as we continue through this conference, because we're going to see more and more detail of the strength of the individual measured by the fidelity with which they will fulfill God's purpose, to see how God moves upon the mind of heathen people through his children. God bless us as we continue with diligence and fidelity to focus on every word that is presented here. This conference is my prayer. Amen.